Hello, and welcome to the Scott Mize Show, a podcast focused on health, diet, bodybuilding, and philosophy. I interview experts, doctors, coaches, and N=1 case studies to answer your questions about improving health, achieving your best physique, and making sustainable progress. We'll cover topics from carnivore and ketogenic diets, to bodybuilding, to life philosophy, and everything in between. Enjoy the show. Carnivore and ketogenic diets can be an excellent way to combat diseases we commonly associate with aging and degeneration in the modern world. But if you're like me, you want to do everything possible to stay in your prime physically and mentally as long as you can, especially with me thinking about starting a family. I really value the most research-backed ingredients and science for bettering the aging process. Today's sponsor is Neurohacker, which packs 7 of the most science-backed senolytic ingredients into one formula called Qualia Senolytic. And you can take it just 2 days a month for fast and noticeable benefits and for a much better aging process. I've been taking Qualia Senolytic for the last month, and I've already noticed a big improvement in my physical and mental energy for my family and friends, and my productivity has improved. I feel invigorated, I feel enthusiastic, and ready to get things done. It's also backed by a 100-day money-back guarantee, so that means you can try it for almost 3 full months, and if you don't like it, there's no risk. You can decide for yourself. If you're in your late 20s or older, adding Qualia Senolytic to your diet can play a crucial role in combating negative aging symptoms. Go to neurohacker.com/Scott for up to 50% off Qualia Senolytic, and as a listener of the show, you can use code SCOTT at checkout for an extra 15% off your first purchase. Again, it's risk-free. Just go to neurohacker.com/Scott to try Qualia Senolytic with code SCOTT and start aging on your own terms. Thanks, and back to the show. Dr. Rachel Brown at Carnivore Shrink on Instagram is a consultant psychiatrist in the UK who specializes in metabolic health and focuses on root cause healing. She graduated from Edinburgh University in 2003 and has worked in psychiatry since 2004. She's a nutrition network advisor and certified functional medicine practitioner. She also holds a master's degree in medical laws and ethics and is involved in ongoing research in ketogenic diets and mental disorders. Dr. Brown is advocate for therapeutic carbohydrate restriction and dietary modification to address underlying metabolic dysfunction and gut dysbiosis as underlying causes of mental disorders. She's the author of the best-selling book, Metabolic Madness: Understand Why Metabolic Health is Key to Mental Health. Your keys to success. Welcome to the show, Dr. Brown.
Hi, thanks so much. It's great to be here.
Yeah, really appreciate it. And just really excited. I always find, we were chatting a little bit before hitting record, find the mental interplay between diet and psychology so fascinating. And I've had a lot of guests on who have had outstanding results themselves from altering their diet, as well as practitioners. So always excited. And I think your approach is really interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. I can't wait to just see what's going to happen in the future in terms of there becoming increasing awareness of the impact that diet and lifestyle can have on mental health.
Yeah. So maybe let's start there. Do you think the narrative, like, how has the narrative changed over time in your mind? Maybe like, what are we coming from? and how do you see it changing with regards to awareness of the effects of diet and nutrition on mental health?
Yeah, so I think sadly, within allopathic medicine, so just sort of Western mainstream medicine, there's not really that much awareness, if any. So I feel fairly on my own in terms of speaking out, certainly amongst colleagues and even potentially in the UK. So I did a teaching session recently for a number of different consultant psychiatrists and kind of going back through the research and actually just educating people on the connections between food and the importance of that in terms of our gut health and systemic inflammation in the body and oxidative stress and all of the different facets that are involved when it comes down to mental health, but also general health. Unfortunately, it tends to be received as something completely novel and almost unheard of, certainly within the medical circles within which I tend to associate, just in terms of my NHS work. But having said that, there are more and more people out there with lived experience, and certainly in psychiatry, that's a really big thing. And there's a lot of emphasis placed on lived experience and listening to people who've lived through having certain disorders and what's worked for them and what hasn't, what's been helpful, what has been unhelpful. And so I think there should be more emphasis placed on people who've actually been real life trials themselves, so their own N of one, who've managed to turn around their health entirely by making lifestyle changes. And obviously, there are different grassroots movements afoot, certainly in terms of the keto community and the carnivore community and other kind of allied health communities. But there's also some more research happening now because of philanthropic donations and concentration and research in the mental health field. So that feels really good, because I think that hasn't been able to happen up to now because, let's face it, the vast majority of research studies are funded by the pharmaceutical industry, and there isn't really going to be much money to be made from recommending a ketogenic diet or a carnivore diet when it comes to mental health or any other neurological conditions that they can potentially benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. And stepping back for a minute, how did you get involved in first psychiatry generally, and then how did that evolve for you and start to involve nutrition and its influence on psychiatry over the years?
Yeah, so when I went to medical school, I knew I had an interest in mental health, and I essentially applied to do medicine to become a psychiatrist. Now, if you'd asked me back then to describe what a psychiatrist was, I probably didn't really have that great an idea. But I just always felt drawn to it and felt that that was my purpose. And so that's how I made my decisions about studying medicine and then training within psychiatry at the earliest opportunity that I could. But having said that, I've had really a lifelong interest in holistic health and natural health treatments and health optimization, but also particularly nutrition. So I've had an interest for a very long time myself, and it's really been my own health journey, I would say, that's led me to kind of low carb and initially a primal. So I was a big follower of Mark Sisson, still am. I really admire a lot of the work that he does. So it was really becoming primal. I went on my own health journey, and that just gradually transitioned into keto, and then coming up for 4 years ago now, carnivore. Personally, and my own personal journey has been that of somebody who has a sugar addiction, although I didn't really fully appreciate that or recognize that until I was carnivore, I would say. So keto helped that a lot. But I had real clarity around that whole issue after going carnivore. And then just within sort of being immersed in the different keto and carnivore communities, I've just come across so many different people, some of whom have completely put symptoms of major mental disorder into remission after years of failed treatments, medications, other physical type treatments that you can get. So that really piqued my curiosity. And I think it was coming across others who'd done really well and had had a lot of success in their treatment that's what piqued my curiosity in relation to combining my two interests and trying to connect the dots there.
Yeah, and it's funny, Mark Sisson was also a giant influence on me early on before keto was even really a thing.
Yeah.
I remember, following Mark's Daily Apple and
Mhm.
following a primal approach, and it's amazing how much of that stuff has really held up. And
Oh
he
yeah.
has such a great balanced overall macro perspective of things, I feel.
Yeah, absolutely. And even when it comes to exercise and barefoot shoes, I've kind of done everything. So
Yeah.
there's just so much of what he's endorsed over the years that I really do agree with, and that yeah, appears very authentic and rings true to myself in terms of my own experience.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. And so how did you start to pull it into your clinical practice and applying
Yeah.
it to people you work with?
Yeah, so in 2020, I studied functional medicine and qualified with a certification in that. And obviously, 2020 was a strange time for everybody, but that really sort of piqued my interest again in terms of holistic health. And it was shortly after that that I found out that Dr. Georgia Eid, who I'm sure a lot of people know, had a program going training clinicians. And that was just music to my ears because in terms of being a psychiatrist and being registered with the Royal College, you have a certain amount of continuous professional development that you have to upkeep, and you have to achieve a certain number of study hours every year on a variety of different topics. And it's safe to say there hasn't been another CPD item that has been of more interest to me than the ketogenic diets for clinicians course that Dr. Georgia Eid runs. And so I trained with her early in 2021. I'm in January of 2021, and it was just really refreshing to have a completely new perspective, almost like a new set of eyes in terms of somebody taking a slightly different approach, but a much more personalized, refined approach to conventional psychiatric assessment. And it was really nice to connect with other clinicians who were doing the training at the time and bounce ideas off each other. So it was training with Dr. Georgia Eid that really has changed my own practice.
This episode is brought to you by LMNT Electrolytes. This month, we're switching it up with an exclusive offer that's only for VIP LMNT partners, including Carnivore Cast listeners. You can now receive this free sample pack along with any regular purchase when you use my custom link, which is provided in the show notes or my Instagram link in bio. That's drinklmnt.com/carnivorecast, all one word. And as I said, I'll include the link in the show notes. LMNT Electrolytes are convenient, evidence-based, and delicious, and get yours today to help support the show. Thank you. Another huge influence on me and a great voice in the community. I'm curious how, so you're also researching the effects of ketogenic diets and mental disorders. Can you talk about that work?
Yeah, so it's yeah, I don't know if I believe in coincidences or not, but it's been good fortune that there just so happened to be a research team in Edinburgh, where I'm based in Scotland, who were already planning in the first stages of a pilot trial, so a pilot study looking at the ketogenic diet in bipolar disorder. So it was really a feasibility study to see how many people could stick with a diet and see what initial improvements or data could be gathered around that. So I found out about it by another doctor who'd worked with me, who went on to work on the study. And so I've kind of joined along with them and been going to their research meetings. And hopefully there's further research in the works. So there are various applications going in for further research funding, but it's been really eye-opening. So it was a very small scale study, so it's hard to draw any clear conclusions from it. But there was certainly a proportion of people within the study who responded really well to the dietary intervention, and actually a lot of people found it. I don't want to say necessarily easy, but they managed to stick with the diet, and they had a good amount of support there for them to do it. So yeah, it's really interesting to see what's going to happen in the future.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I actually took a big trip to Scotland in 2013. I was there for 8 days. We went all around the Isle of Skye, and just such a beautiful country. I was not into carnivore, keto, primal back then. It was a lot of craft beer.
Okay, yeah,
but
sounds about right.
I remember the seafood was incredible. Do you feel like there's a good carnivore, ketogenic aware community in Scotland?
I don't know about in Scotland. There are a few people. So we had, gosh, when was it? It was March of this year. There was the first public health collaborative meeting in Scotland. And the Public Health Collaborative is really based in England, and there's a much larger organization there, but there is some representation in Scotland. And I was lucky enough to go along and speak at that meeting. And it was really touching from my point of view, because the room was just full of people who get it and understand the importance of keto. And not just that. So in fact, when we were waiting to go into the venue, a couple of people stopped me who obviously recognized me from social media or followed me little to my awareness, and that they were just telling me their success stories. So one lady said that she had been ketogenic for 10 years, and it had put her cancer into remission, and that's why she started doing keto all those years ago. And then there were other people with various other health issues. I think somebody with Parkinson's, or maybe that was a relative of theirs. But obviously the relative had come along to find out more about this day, because all of the talks were centered around metabolic health. But there were just so many just lovely success stories that were being exchanged, and a couple of other people who'd used it kind of a bit more for mental health. And then of course there were lots of other people I didn't even get a chance to speak to, because it was a busy morning and quite a few other speakers there too. But I think there's a growing community, and then obviously, well, maybe not obviously for people, but there's going to be a much bigger public health collaborative meeting next month in Sheffield, and there's some big names coming to that, including Georgia Eade herself, and Ben Bickman, and Sean Baker, and Anthony Chafee, and quite a few others. So
Yeah, it's a great group. And actually, Sam Feltham, back when he had Smash the Fat, which was like a podcast before there were podcasts,
okay.
was actually like my first influence in this kind of world. And I think what he was essentially advocating was kind of like a ketogenic diet before ketogenic diets were very popular. With I remember he had a focus on fat, good sources of fat, fatty meats. He wasn't really into macro ratios or counting protein or things like that, but really restricting carbohydrates to like leafy vegetables and low sugar fruits. And yeah, he's just an amazing individual. And then like devoting himself to the public health collaboration, I think it's really awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. So I hadn't really been aware of Sam before that day that we had the Scottish meeting, but he was there and I got to meet with him, and it's quite clear the passion that he has for the organization, and just trying to get good information out there to people to enable people to help themselves when it comes to health. Because I think that's really important. I think it shouldn't really be the case that people should rely on doctors to give them health advice. I would always be an advocate of asking people to do their own research and to satisfy themselves on any particular subject, because we're not always given the best information, let's face it.
Yeah, for sure. And you talk about focusing on root cause healing. Can you talk about what that means to you? And just elaborate on that.
Yeah, gosh. So there's so much more that I still have to do on that, and want to do on that, and plan to do on that. So that's more kind of moving into the functional medicine realm of practice. So within my NHS work, unfortunately, it's not really possible to use all the tools that would be at your disposal as a functional medicine practitioner. But I suppose my approach to try to keep some of the root cause healing in my mind has really been diving into the research and really trying to promote the use of ketogenic diets for mental health, for major mental disorders, because really a lot of the time difficulties often come back to mitochondrial dysfunction, and that applies across a range of different chronic health conditions. But also the link between gut health and brain health is also another major interest of mine. And certainly in functional medicine, we would consider gut health to be a cornerstone of health across all different bodily systems. So I've been just been trying to promote the research that is already out there and exists, because unfortunately I think we're very busy and stretched within the National Health Service, and although there are regulations around how much continuing professional development doctors and other allied staff do, there's not necessarily a lot of time for people to think outside the box, and you somewhat rely on conferences that are being organized, and then you get down the rabbit hole of who funds what organizations. And it's been nice to try and take a step back, and it's just really come from my own interest on the whole metabolic health and its connection to mental health.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I think there's still a lot we don't know, but there's so much potential to help people by looking at these other vectors, such as gut health, and their tie-ins with how our brain functions. And can you talk about like some of the research you've done or research others have done on how changing our nutrition through therapeutic carbohydrate restriction or other means can impact our mental health, and how what are some of the causes there and the effects?
Yeah, so probably one of the most recent studies that I tend to think of is the study that came out of France with Dr. Albert Danan, and Dr. Georgia Eid was involved in that research as well. And that was a psychiatrist who, I think there were around about 28 patients in the end that they had completed data on in the study. And these were patients that that psychiatrist had followed up for quite a number of years and knew very, very well. And they had treatment-resistant illnesses, so they had ongoing symptoms despite multiple medication trials, and using all of the sort of standard approaches we would tend to use within psychiatry. And he admitted to them to hospital and then put them on a ketogenic diet. And everybody's symptoms improved over the course of time that they were there. A significant proportion lost weight. Quite a few managed to reduce their medications. Some even managed to discontinue medications. And these were people with major diagnoses such as major depression, bipolar disorder, I think schizophrenia or schizoaffective. I forget the exact details. So that was certainly very remarkable results, I would say. I'm obviously a real believer and very invested in addressing underlying root causes of all sorts of health disorders. But unfortunately, I'm just aware that some colleagues, when they heard about that study, were just immediately very cynical about it. And there was someone who made a comment saying, "Well, if we can actually believe this," and which is disappointing. But that's just one example. And I think the difficulty is that we don't have randomized controlled trials within psychiatry of ketogenic diets, but we do have a huge amount of research in terms of the use of ketogenic diets for treatment-resistant epilepsy, including Cochrane reviews on that matter. And we do often use anti-epileptic medications within psychiatry for quite a few different diagnoses. Other research, there have been quite a few kind of case studies over the years and case series. But again, that's relied on individual clinicians reporting improvements in patients. And some of those have been very remarkable. There was one from quite a few decades ago of someone who was in their 60s. They could have even been close to 70. And they'd had decades and decades of psychotic symptoms and a diagnosis of schizophrenia. And these symptoms were persistent. When they were put on a ketogenic diet, the symptoms resolved entirely, and the person actually managed to get off their medications that they'd been on for many, many years. But there are quite a few other similar but shorter duration case reports out there. And there are a few studies within different diagnoses, such as Alzheimer's disease. So Alzheimer's is a big one in terms of the deficits you get in terms of glucose processing within the brain and the insulin resistance that develops in Alzheimer's disease. And so ketogenic diets can be incredibly successful or potentially therapeutic in those situations. And then there are others for ASD. So there are a few studies in children looking at autism spectrum disorders showing improvements. Some of them just removing casein, so dairy and gluten, and then others showing that a ketogenic diet was superior to even that gluten-free, casein-free diet, which also improved the symptoms of autism. But there was one particular study in children, I think there were about 40, 45 children, and they found that the children who went on a ketogenic diet improved their functioning overall, and their improvements were superior to those who did the gluten-free, casein-free diet. There'll be others as well off the top of my head that I just can't immediately think of.
Yeah. And you talked about for yourself, carbohydrate and sugar addiction. Can you talk about some of the impacts there of changing diet? And I think there's sometimes this reaction from certain parts of the health community that like you shouldn't cut out a food group entirely, that creates unsustainable diet practices, can lead to binging, etc. Curious how you think about that and what you've seen in the research and your clinical practice.
Yeah, so when people make those sort of arguments, I just automatically go to the ancestral perspective and back to a lot of the work that Mark Sisson has done over the years. And Tim Noakes is another one. So I couldn't have any more respect for a clinician or somebody within the field than I do for Tim Noakes. And a lot of the training I've done with the Nutrition Network, they cover it very comprehensively in terms of evolution and evolutionary perspective. And you know, I think processed foods unfortunately make up a huge proportion of the modern diet these days, and it just becomes normalized within society and culture because the vast majority of foods that you get when you go to the supermarket are highly processed and full of junk foods such as seed oils or vegetable oils, as some people call them. So yeah, I always go back to the ancestral perspective and argument, and I think it's very difficult to argue against that one. And from my own personal experience, so I spent years thinking that I had a bit of an emotional eating problem, because I didn't fully recognize that it was actually, I think from my own personal perspective, and I know people can have entirely different experiences, but it was actually a physical addiction problem with sugar in the end. So keto really helped that. So I didn't feel that I had the same sort of compulsions around food when I was keto as I would have done even when I was primal. So I was still including a fair bit of 70% cocoa or above dark chocolate when I was doing primal. And giveaways would be just sort of tendency to snack in the evenings. But even when I was keto, there were a few foods that were still a bit compulsive, and it was, hindsight is a wonderful thing. So I wasn't necessarily fully aware of that during the time of being keto, but after going carnivore, it actually just really highlighted to me that there were still a few trigger type foods, one of them being nut butters, and still the dark chocolate in there to an extent when I was keto. And so when I went carnivore, it's hard to remember all of my thoughts over the years, but I certainly do remember recognizing that there had been a shift in terms of my thinking to the point of people talk about food freedom, but having plenty of time when I just had absolutely no preoccupation whatsoever with food. So being able to eat to satiety, feel completely nourished by what you're eating, and then not even need to think about food for hours and hours on end because you're fat adapted and you're not going through the sort of highs and lows of blood sugar crashes and insulin release that you would get on other diets. And so carnivore just has really revolutionized my relationship with food, I would say, because it's just very easy now. I eat because I'm hungry and because I need nourishment and nutrients, and I eat a nutrient-dense diet, and then I go for hours between meals. And that was something else that became a lot easier, was fasting when I went carnivore, because I tried that a bit when I was keto, but always felt like I was forcing it a bit. Although I've dialed that way back now. But anyway, it's it's been a really interesting journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And can you talk about some of the ways in which you've helped clients with introducing ketogenic or carnivore style diets, carbohydrate restriction? What are some of the things that you've helped people with, and how has it worked for them?
Yeah, so I work within quite a busy crisis service in Edinburgh. So the people I tend to see are in an acute crisis when it comes to their mental health. So some of them will be severely depressed or psychotic. Suicidal tends to be a very common complaint that we're dealing with, an acute suicidality. And so it's not always appropriate to have this sort of diet discussion, depending what else we've been discussing in the consultation. But I certainly do speak to a lot more people now about diet than I would have done in years gone by. And I've had one particular person very recently with a bipolar disorder who'd been unwell for a long time. And sort of somewhat uncharacteristically had been with our service for a long time, because we tend to see people just very short term, but this person just couldn't get out of the bit with a severe agitated depression and bipolar disorder, and had various problems with medications, and also had a liking for natural treatments, and really a wish to not be on medications unnecessarily, or if they could avoid it entirely. And in the end, after speaking to her a couple of times, they decided that they were going to try a ketogenic diet, and actually they've done incredibly well. And within a week of transitioning over to a ketogenic diet, their mental state improved significantly. And within 2 weeks, they were sort of 80 to 90% improved in comparison to what they had been for the prior 7 months. And that person I continue to follow up. So I've started a small metabolic psychiatry clinic within the NHS, in which I work, and I'm following that person up and troubleshooting with them when things come up. But they've actually been doing incredibly well, and much, much better than they had been doing for the majority of the year before they went keto. And there are various other people. So I see all sorts of people. Someone recently had chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia. And so again, it felt relevant to have a conversation regarding mitochondrial health for them. And there's so many benefits of a ketogenic diet in terms of our mitochondria. And then someone else recently with awful gastrointestinal symptoms, who'd been told by their general practitioner that was nothing more they could do for them. And when I asked them, "What are you eating?" They said cereal, toast, and biscuits. And I thought, okay, hang on, we need to go back to basics here. And actually, they were incredibly receptive to the information, and just said that they'd never ever heard any of this before, but they had some professional training in their background to do with the food industry. And in actual fact, it had just been years since they'd worked in that industry, and it all sort of made sense what I was talking about. And so they were very appreciative, and I haven't actually seen them since. So I don't know what they've done with it, but I tend to give people a lot of the information that Georgia Eid armed me with, and allow people to do their own research. So for some people, I say maybe now is not quite the right time, but you might want to go down this rabbit hole and look into it when things are a bit more stable. And I had a family very recently where I was recommending they look at it in terms of their daughter. And actually, the next time I went back to the house, I didn't bring the subject up because we were talking about other things that time. And when I was getting up to leave, the parents stopped me and said, "Oh, we've looked into the keto stuff, and actually we both started keto." So that really amused me.
Wow, that's
And
great.
they were trying it out before maybe the daughter was going to think about it. So yeah, it's really, that's what gets me excited and makes me feel really satisfied when people, you can just give them the right places to look for information and then let them go off and do some research themselves and see what they think.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fantastic. I can tell you've been doing this a long time, because you don't force it on people, you don't push it on people, but you sprinkle it in tactfully in the right
Yeah,
situations, and let
yeah,
people
yeah.
come to you when they're ready.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's no one wants to be forced into anything. So I generally think people get there better when they do it in their own time.
Yeah, absolutely. What areas of research or um, changes in the way education works, or kind of, we spoke a little bit at the beginning about awareness for the impacts of nutrition on mental health. What areas are you most excited about, interested in, over the coming years going forward?
Yeah, so metabolic health is a huge one. So everything that the Public Health Collaborative is driving forward, particularly Dr. David Unwin's work, and Dr. Jen Unwin's work in terms of sugar addiction and food addiction more widely. I really like the research that Dr. Unwin has done, because he's done it very by the book, and it's a very accessible, respectable paper that will appeal to many clinicians within the NHS. And so I would hope over time that, particularly for type 2 diabetes, there might be some sort of shift in attitude and focus in terms of the research for that. And you just have to hope that that will eventually pervade across other fields, particularly if we can get research demonstrating benefits of ketogenic metabolic therapy for major mental disorders. But at the same time, I feel very aligned with the functional medicine approach, which I can't really practice within the NHS. And so I'm aware there is a growing community of functional medicine clinicians within the UK and internationally. And so I would hope that side of things would grow too. Ideally, it would be really nice if we could have that within the National Health Service, but I suspect just the way things are going politically and with funding and so on, that might not be realistic.
Yeah, that makes sense. And can you talk a little bit about your book, Rachel? What was the impetus for that? What does it cover? And who's it for?
Yeah, so I wrote that book partly for myself, but really I had other sort of just your everyday person in mind when I wrote it, because after doing George's course and then trying to revisit the research myself, I really wanted to piece together into a coherent narrative, really, just how the research and what we know so far all pieces together, with a bit of a functional medicine influence, particularly in terms of the gut-brain connection or gut-brain axis. And so I wanted to put something down on paper, essentially, that I often don't, everything I want to tell people, but I often have very little time to do so. So I just wanted to make it an accessible read, and also to have a place for myself to refer back to, and a place to point people in the direction of if they want a bit of an overview of metabolic psychiatry and the clear connections between metabolic health and mental health.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think it's an excellent resource for individuals and practitioners alike to learn more about a lot of your research and the science and theory and practical application behind diet and mental health.
Yeah, and I was just going to pick up on something that you said earlier, because I feel like there's a bit of tension within the kind of nutrition community, in that I don't know how best to put this, that there are nutritionists or dietitians very qualified in the use of ketogenic diets, and you get very specific types and subtypes of ketogenic diets, particularly for medical applications. So in terms of epilepsy, and some people have the opinion that someone should always work with a dietitian when they're initiating a ketogenic diet. But then on the flip side of that, I know plenty of others, and myself included, where people have just been able to transition into that lifestyle armed with good information and a bit of trial and error. And I suppose I just want to say, I think most people would be able to look at the information that's out there and to transition. Some of them might want to transition a bit more slowly into lower carb, and I think that's absolutely fine. But I don't really want a ketogenic diet to be made into something inaccessible, or even, God forbid, some people think it's potentially dangerous. And, there are a few contraindications for it, but generally those conditions are fairly rare. And I suppose I often just think about kind of Ken Berry's work. I'm a big fan of Ken Berry as well, and sort of proper human diet, as he refers to it as. And I tend to like to think that not everybody needs to track meticulously, and not everybody needs to be checking their ketone levels. And a lot of people can benefit from just actually going to a natural whole foods diet and picking nutrient-dense foods and concentrating on eliminating some of the biggest offenders, such as seed oils and sugar and refined carbs. And a lot of people could benefit just from taking those steps, without necessarily having to fine-tune their ketone levels to within a very specific range. But obviously, you will get some people who've had more problematic illnesses who may need to go to those greater efforts and may need additional support to do that.
Yep. That makes perfect sense. Well, Rachel, thank you so much for coming on today. Really appreciate it. It's great to meet you and learn more about your work. Where can folks find you online if they want to connect with you, follow along, get in touch?
Yeah, so well, I'm on Instagram as Carnivore Shrink, so I probably post most of my information on Instagram. I'm not really a very big Twitter person. I should mention that I'm going to be doing mental health metabolic mental health coaching with a colleague of mine, Ali Houston. And so people can sign up to get updates from us via our website, which is www.metpsy.com. So it stands for Metabolic Psychiatry, just METPSY. And that's a really exciting kind of venture we have planned for later this year, doing group coaching for people and to provide more support out there. Ali himself is also trained with Dr. Georgia Eid too, and has his own kind of recovery story in terms of mental health and diet, and his own sort of coaching business too, and experience. So people can find us there. And I have a website, foodforthoughtpsychiatrist.com as well.
Excellent. Well, I'll get all those links from you and have them in the show notes so folks can easily visit it. And thank you so much for coming on today, Dr. Brown. Really appreciate it. It's great to learn from you, and really appreciate your time. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure the audience has too.
Oh, thank you for having me. Anytime. I think just more people need to know about this stuff. So thank you.
Thank you for listening to the show. You can find The Scott Mize Show on Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Please leave a comment, like, review, or share the podcast with your friends or followers. It helps more people find the show.